We're really excited to have you all here. So this is Coordinated Approach to Preventing Stalking, the New York City CAPS model. So we're going to get fund our department and have been really supportive in helping us bring stalking awareness out across the country. So thank you, OVW. So just I want everyone to be aware of kind of what we do and the resources we have available. So the Stalking Resource Center provides in-person training, webinars, individual and organizational assistance. We have a bunch of fact sheets, brochures, manuals, guides. We help with policy and protocol development and individualized consultations. We have lots of videos on our YouTube page and our website. All of our resources are online, and then we also coordinate National Stalking Awareness Month at stalkingawarenessmonth.org. So, January, Stalking Awareness Month, we are updating all of our materials as we speak, and those should be up hopefully by the end of the week. So I hope everyone's starting to think about what they're going to do for Stalking Awareness Month. Finally, I just wanted to give a shout out to our Train the Trainer conference. So we're going to be hosting this in New Orleans, January 23rd through the 25th. The link to apply is right there on the screen. So this is going to be a Train the Trainer for individuals who provide training in their communities. So if you train advocates, law enforcement, prosecutors, that type of thing, this might be a great opportunity for you. So more information is at that link on the screen there. So I'm going to introduce our speakers today. First is Elena Roberts here at the Stalking Resource Center. She's the legal director. She handles the legal technical assistance. She also does a lot of our trainings to advocates, law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, pretty much everything Elena can do. So before she was at the SRC, she was ADA in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where she prosecuted violent crimes, community crimes, and metro divisions. So Liz Dank is the Deputy Commissioner and General Counsel in the New York City Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence. As a program director, Liz created and implemented a homicide prevention initiative to increase the identification of intimate partner stalking cases and enhance stalking arrests and prosecutions. Before that, she was a DA in the Queens County DA office prosecuting domestic violence cases. Anthony Messia was appointed to the NYPD in 2008 and was promoted in 2013 to sergeant. Sergeant Messia is now assigned to the Office of the Chief of Department Domestic Violence Unit since October 2014, and during this time he has assisted in overseeing the New York City Police Department's response to domestic violence. So thank you all for being here. We're really excited to hear from you. I'm going to turn it over now to Elena Roberts, and she's going to get us started.
Thank you so much, Jess. I really appreciate the warm welcome and introduction, and I also want to thank not only Patricia, who is helping us through NCJ, FCJ, their TA providers. They're helping us with this webinar, so I want to thank them. I also want to thank Liz and Sergeant Messia for appearing with us today from the New York City Mayor's Office on this very important topic. As Jess said, January is Stalking Awareness Month. That is coming up in just a few months, and it's not too early to start thinking about how you're going to bring recognition to the crime of stalking. And we're really looking forward to hearing how the initiative started and how they implemented it. So thank you again for being with us, Liz and Sergeant Messia. You know, I just want to start out by asking how many of you, and this is just something that I want you to think to yourselves, how many of you have ever worked on a stalking case? So you've either investigated it, you've prosecuted it, maybe you've worked with a stalking victim. For those of you who have had experience working with a stalking victim in some capacity, please use the chat box on the right-hand side to just tell me a little bit about what some of the behaviors that you saw that were occurring for that victim. So maybe it was text messages, maybe it was showing up at work, whatever it was, just give me an idea of some of the behaviors that you have seen. So I'm seeing that text messages were being sent, and that's very common. We see hundreds and hundreds. There's harassing via Facebook or basically any type of social media, driving by the residence and work, using GPS on her car and then texting her, following her in person. And that's interesting because we now know that New York City has Jackie's Law because of the homicide that occurred with the GPS. Text messages and Facebook, again, computer monitoring, so maybe something like spyware was going on. This is an interesting one, bringing her flowers all the time. So basically something that was not threatening in and of itself, something like flowers or gifts. Threatening voice messages, using the family court. We're going to look into that. Basically using the civil and criminal justice systems to harass the victim. Basically going to friends and family members, in other words, using third parties to help with the stalking. We have broke into her house while no one was there, so we have a burglary. This is also important because it really brings to light how many different types of behaviors can be occurring that then combine to make up the crime of stalking. Stalking is not easily identifiable in and of itself because a lot of the behaviors, other than the breaking in entering, other than the criminal damage to property, I see here like a burglary where he moved things around in the house. That's also very common. But a lot of times we're talking about behaviors that aren't criminal in and of themselves. So when we look at some of this, looking at someone's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter account several times a day, maybe even hundreds of times a day, is that stalking? What about texting someone over 100 times even? What if I text someone 200 times in a day? Showing up repeatedly in the same place as someone. Repeated posting on someone's social media or about someone on your social media page. Are these stalking in and of themselves? And the answer is we really have to look at how stalking is defined in your jurisdiction. What we'll find is there are generally 4 elements that make up a stalking statute. And one of those elements is fear. So when we look at how it's defined broadly, we see that stalking is a pattern of behavior. So that's something that's occurring usually 2 or more times that's directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. The specific person, of course, is your victim, but a lot of statutes include third parties like family members, significant others, siblings, children, whoever might be in the household. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So as you see, we're talking about fear right off the bat. Context in a stalking case is absolutely critical. If you look over to the side in the chat box, look at all of the things that you all wrote down. A lot of those, not only are they not criminal, but let's think back to the one who wrote that the stalker was sending flowers multiple times, right? Flowers all the time. Again, that's not a threatening act in and of itself, but what was it about it that was causing fear in that victim? And so we have to look at the context. Something may be frightening to the victim, but not to you. So somehow, if those flowers were inducing fear in that victim, that was causing her fear or him fear, then again, put all those patterns together, you have stalking. If it wasn't causing the victim fear, then you don't have stalking, right? We know that stalking behaviors often have specific meaning that is only understood between the offender and the victim. And in a moment, we're going to look at a statistic where we see that most often the stalker will be known to the victim. And usually it will be a current or former intimate partner. And so when you think about that statistic, this makes sense that stalking behaviors will have specific meaning that is only understood between these 2 people. And it makes sense because who knows you best? Who knows how to give you that look, how to give you that gesture? And you know exactly what it means without that person having to communicate it. We also know that stalking criminalizes otherwise non-criminal behavior. So again, we're talking about things like posting on social media sites, text messaging, showing up in public places, emails, phone calls, things that in and of themselves may look innocuous. We know that stalking is a crime in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, the U.S. territories. Federally, we have our own stalking statute. The Uniform Code of Military Justice and many tribal codes have a separate stalking statute. Let me just say, if you have not read through your stalking statute, please do so. Every stalking statute is different. While the 4 elements might be similar, right, where we have fear, we have that it's a pattern of behavior or a course of conduct, things like that, but they're all going to differ slightly. So please read your stalking statute, be familiar with it. That's going to help you either investigate them, go to the prosecutor with them. As a prosecutor, you'll recognize it better. As a victim advocate, you'll be better able to assist the victim if they choose to report. But even if they don't, you can help them with things like threat assessments and safety planning. So when we look at the prevalence of stalking across the United States, we see that 7.5 million people are stalked in the U.S. every single year. How do we know this? We know this because the Centers for Disease Control conducts an ongoing random sample telephone survey. It comes out every year in the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, or what we call the NISVIS. These findings are from 2011, so you can see by the time the surveys are done, the research is accumulated, and then it's published, it's several years later. And they don't just call people and ask, hey, have you been stalked in the last 12 months? Because most people would say either no, or I don't know, or what's stalking, right? And so what they have to do is they ask a series of questions. And based on the responses, they either say, yes, this person has experienced stalking-related behaviors in the last 12 months, or no, this person has not experienced stalking behaviors in the last 12 months. So how this breaks down by gender is that 4% of women will be stalked every year and 2% of men. If you want to look at the lifetime, we see that more than 1 in 7 women will be stalked in their lifetime, and 1 in 18 men will be stalked in their lifetime. By the way, let me go back to that for a second. You can calculate this for your own state and for your own community. So if you take the population in your state or your town or your city and take 4% of the female population and 2% of the male population and then add those numbers together, that will give you the statistical number of stalking victims that exist in your community or in your state. If you have any questions about that, you can always follow back up with us, and I can certainly help you run those numbers for your specific jurisdiction. When we look at the stalking dynamics, we see that 18 to 24-year-olds experience the highest rates of stalking. But that's not to say that stalking can't extend over the course of a lifetime, and oftentimes it does. So it's not unusual to see a stalking victim in their 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s. Additionally, you might have a situation where the stalking started when they were in their 20s and it has extended over several decades. And it may not be as consistent, say every week or every month, but just consistent enough that it still creates that pattern or that course of conduct. But we see that 18 to 24-year-olds generally experience the highest rates, and this makes sense. These are people who are oftentimes in and out of relationships, perhaps navigating it for the first time, perhaps even out of supervision, away from their parents or away from any type of parental parameters. Additionally, you have college, usually that's happening for this age group, and so you have a lot of people on a concentrated area, a very small area, that are engaging in very similar behaviors, and it's very easy to figure out their class schedules, their extracurricular activities, where they live on campus, and so it's very easy to be able to engage in stalking behavior. We also know that women are more likely to experience stalking than men, and that most offenders are going to be male. So it is not an equal opportunity crime. More women will be stalked and more offenders will be male. Again, that's not to say that we don't have male victims, because we absolutely do. And when we see males as victims, there are two things to note. Number one, they're equally likely to be stalked by a man or a woman. And number two, oftentimes when the male is the subject of the stalking, it's because of something that we call target dispersion, where they become the secondary target of the stalker's attention. So it might be the new detective, the new sergeant, the new victim advocate, the new boyfriend, the new husband that is now in that victim's life, and they become the secondary target. We also know that 3 out of 4 victims, that could be a coworker, a classmate, even a neighbor, but most of the time, as I mentioned before, it will be a current or former intimate partner. In fact, the research shows that in about half of all stalking cases, it will in fact be a current or former intimate partner. And this is significant. This really is going to help shape how we investigate these types of cases, how we prosecute them, the behaviors that we should be looking for, and as victim advocates, how we are, again, doing those threat assessments and the safety planning with these victims, particularly if the relationship is still intact, particularly if the victim is thinking about or has attempted to separate from their abuser. As I mentioned earlier, stalkers are extremely manipulative. They will use whatever and whomever they can to get at their victims. So earlier we saw in the chat box that the stalker was using the family court or the civil court to harass that victim, and that's not uncommon. As you see to the right-hand side, we see that stalkers will use both the civil and the criminal systems to get at that victim, whether that's taking them to court to redo child custody, to redo divorce proceedings. Maybe they're filing false police reports, or they're taking out protection orders saying that they're the victim and they're the ones being harassed and stalked. The number one reason why stalkers will do this is to see the victim, to get that victim into their physical presence in the courtroom so that they can see them. But we see that they'll also use people. So they'll use kids if kids are involved. And again, think back to half of all of our stalkers are going to be a current or former intimate partner, so it's likely that children will be involved. And children are used to gather information about the non-offending parent, where they live, what their routines are, if they're seeing anybody. They might be delivering technology to the child, which they then use to spy on the non-offending parent. Maybe it's GPS, a camera, spyware. Maybe it's a new cell phone that has a family locator plan on it. And so they're using the kids to gather that information, to track, to monitor, and surveil the non-offending parent. We also see, in terms of using people, that at least half of all of our intimate partner stalkers will use a third party, what's known as proxy stalking, to help them with their stalking. So if you look down at the bottom, we see that 50 to 60% of intimate partner stalking victims say that others were involved in their stalking. Sometimes the third parties know that they're engaging in the stalking behavior and that they're helping the stalker. And sometimes these third parties are just innocent people that are providing what they think is helpful information to the stalker, and they don't realize they're helping the stalker to track and monitor and surveil the victim. We also see that stalkers have a really high recidivism rate, and one of the ways we see that is that they violate orders of protection at really high rates. So you see that 81% of male victims said that their protection orders had been violated, and nearly 70% of female victims said that their orders of protection had been violated. And so this is a person that doesn't take no for an answer from the victim. And don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying that victims have to say to stop or that the behavior is unwanted, because nowhere in our legal system is that required for a stalking statute. But a lot of times victims will have tried to mitigate and stop the behaviors before they go to any other person, whether that's a family member or a friend, but certainly before they go to the police. But this is a person who doesn't stop with that. They don't stop when the police get involved and ask them to stop, and they certainly don't stop when a judge gets involved and issues a piece of paper that says that they need to stop the behavior. So they have really high recidivism rates. And we see the use of technology being used more and more. I would say it would be a very unusual case at this point in time that you would investigate or work with a victim who is being stalked and there was no technology that was being used whatsoever. I think we can just safely assume that going forward, phones, cameras, GPS, social networking sites, spyware, even assistive technologies, all of these things, and even things that we probably haven't even thought of yet, are being misused to monitor victims. When we look at the pattern of behavior that oftentimes does make up stalking, we see that 2/3 of stalkers will pursue their victims at least once per week, and generally they're pursuing them multiple times per week. We see that almost 80% of stalkers will use more than one means of approach, and what that means is that maybe they'll start out texting the victim, and either the victim is not responding or they're not giving the desired response, so they change their tactic. Now I'm going to start posting things on her social media page. Maybe that doesn't work, so I'm going to start showing up in places, and I continue to change how I approach the victim to get the response that I want. We also see that weapons are used to harm or threaten victims in about 20% of the cases. Now, that's not a super high statistic. It's less than a quarter of all cases when we look at weapons that are used. However, what we do see is that the people that are more likely to make up that 20% that use the weapons are our current or former intimate partner stalkers. So they are more threatening and they are our more dangerous type of stalker. As I mentioned before, stalkers have a really high recidivism rate. This is important to note for a number of different reasons. If you're a victim advocate, you know that this has got to be part of your safety planning because this person is going to continue to stalk the victim even when there has been some type of system intervention. As an investigator, again, you know that either your stalking case is going to continue to go on, you're going to continue to build on it, or you're going to file new charges because you, again, have multiple incidents that are occurring and you can now charge an additional charge of stalking. Same thing for the prosecutor. You should be either bumping up your charges or filing those new charges for stalking. When we look at the statistics, we see that recidivism will occur in about 60% of the cases. So we're looking at well over half of all stalking cases. This is going to occur. And so you can pretty much just count on this, right? It's over half. It's well over half that this is going to occur. And just to put it in perspective, for those of you who work in the domestic violence field, when we look at the DV reabuse, we see that that occurs in 24 to 60% of cases. And that's a really high percentage as well. But just to put it in perspective, while those are high percentages, stalking cases, well, I guess stalkers will recidivate at the high end of what we look at for the reabuse. So we're starting out at 60%, which is the high end of the reabuse rate. We also see that there is a correlation between stalking and domestic violence, and this is oftentimes why stalking gets eclipsed by what I would consider to be the most or the more prominent crime that's occurred, so whether it's domestic violence or criminal damage to a property or a sexual assault, a lot of times these crimes are co-occurring, but we're just not identifying each of them separately. But stalking does co-occur at really high rates with stalking as well as, with domestic violence as well as other crimes. As I mentioned, our intimate partners are our most dangerous stalkers. they are more, or I should say our intimate partner stalkers are our more dangerous stalkers. They are more likely to physically approach the victim. And again, this makes sense because who knows you best? Who knows what you're afraid of? Who knows how to push your buttons? Who knows your routines, your daily routines? It's usually our current or former intimate partners. They are more insulting and interfering and threatening. They're more likely to use weapons. This goes back to that 20% statistic. The behaviors are more likely to escalate quickly. And again, although we have a really high recidivism rate generally, it is our intimate partner stalkers that are more likely to reoffend. There are more separation attempts partner violence alone when it comes to our intimate partner stalking victims, and intimate partner stalkers are actually more likely than non-intimate partner stalkers to assault third parties. So again, we're looking at family members, current boyfriends, current girlfriends, maybe even coworkers and classmates. And with that, that is a really brief overview of stalking from the Stalking Resource Center. And now I'm going to turn it over to Liz with the New York City Mayor's Office to tell you all about the CAPS program.
Great, thank you, Elena, and hi everyone. We're excited to be here today with you all to talk about what we're doing here in New York City around stalking. I wanted to start by just giving an overview of my office. So the New York City Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence was established in 2001. It's the only government office in the country that's solely dedicated to the issue of domestic violence. And the role our office plays in the city is around coordinating the citywide delivery of domestic violence services, developing policies and programs, and working with communities around the city to raise awareness about domestic violence. One of the key programs that our office operates is the New York City Family Justice Centers. Sorry, we're just going to skip ahead a slide. There we go. So the New York City Family Justice Centers are operated by the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence. We have 5 family justice centers throughout the city, 1 in each borough. We actually just opened our 5th center in Staten Island earlier this year, completing our vision of having an FJC in every borough. Each of the centers are co-located with district attorney's offices, have NYPD domestic violence prevention officers on site, and we also have staff from over 35 community partners who provide a wide range of comprehensive services to victims. The FJCs are walk-in centers, and all the services are free and confidential, and clients can access the services at the center regardless of their language, income, immigration status, gender identity, or sexual orientation. So before we talk about the CAPS model, I just wanted to give a snapshot of what we're looking at here in New York City when it comes to domestic violence. So I have a couple of statistics here that I think will highlight the prevalence of domestic violence occurrence that we're seeing in New York City. In 2015, so last year, there were over 230 calls per day to the New York City Domestic Violence Hotline. And of those, 19 per day were requests for domestic violence shelter. The NYPD responds to over 200 reports for intimate partner violence every day. And last year, we had 26 intimate partner-related homicides in New York City. So to start talking about the CAPS program, the idea for the program focused specifically on intimate partner stalking cases, and was actually developed through the stories of clients that we heard in a program that we had operational in Staten Island from 2012 to 2016 called our Staten Island Domestic Violence Response Team. That program was a coordinated approach to addressing the issue with multiple community partners and city agencies, providing rapid responses to high-risk cases by working together to meet the service and safety needs of clients. And what we learned through the Staten Island Domestic Violence Response Team was that in 2013, so the second year the program was in operation, 69% of the clients in that program had reported being stalked by their abuser within the 6 months prior to joining the program. We were surprised to see that stalking behavior was actually higher than most of the other common abusive behaviors that we see, in these cases, including physical injury, imprisonment, strangulation, use of a weapon. So we knew that we were hearing experiences from clients about stalking that we needed to take seriously. And it was actually the lived experiences from the clients that helped to inform the need for a better coordinated approach to this issue in Staten Island. It's interesting that, so in this same year in 2013, when about 70% of the clients were reporting stalking, we saw that in New York City there were only 118 stalking arrests throughout the entire city, and of these, none were felony stalking arrests, so it was 118 misdemeanor stalking arrests. So we had discussed the findings that we saw through this program with the New York City Police Department and the local district attorney's office, and decided that we wanted to develop a coordinated approach to addressing stalking, especially given the high risk factor for lethality that stalking presented. So the result of these discussions was the CAPS program, the Coordinated Approach to Preventing Stalking. The CAPS program is a homicide prevention program that we developed, which is specifically aimed at identifying intimate partner stalking cases and providing appropriate criminal justice and social services interventions. And we ideally wanted to identify these cases early on before there was an opportunity to escalate to serious physical injury or fatality. We know that stalking is a high risk factor for lethality. Nationally, over 54% of female homicide victims report stalking to the police before they're killed by their intimate partner. So we understood that we needed to identify these cases early on before they had an opportunity to escalate. So there were several goals of the CAPS program. The first was to increase the identification of intimate partner violence stalking cases. As you already heard mentioned earlier in the presentation, most stalking victims know their stalker. So while we often hear about celebrities being stalked or public figures being stalked, in actuality, it's often that the stalking victims are stalked by somebody that they know. So 61% of female victims and 44% of male victims are stalked by a current or former intimate partner. We also understood that victims are not often walking into precincts or to advocate's office or attorney's offices and saying, I'm being stalked, but whether they're describing this ongoing course of conduct or these ongoing series of events that are occurring to them. And so we wanted to stress how important it is to listen to what is being reported by the victim and to ask those follow-up questions, understanding that victims might not use stalking language when they're describing stalking incidents. And then the other key factor was, for this goal, was reviewing multiple reports for harassing behavior and course of conduct to see whether or not they make out a stalking offense. We know that 46% of stalking victims experience at least one unwanted contact per week. So we wanted to stress how important it is that during the investigation stage or when a victim is meeting with an advocate, that those questions are really being asked about whether there were other incidents that occurred or other interactions that occurred in addition to the one that was currently being reported. The second goal of the CAPS program was to enhance stalking arrests and prosecutions. So one of the biggest pieces of this program was learning how to better understand the New York State stalking statute and how to apply it in cases. We created a cheat sheet that assisted with helping to charge within the stalking statute, explaining some of the specific language in the statute, like what makes up a course of conduct, what does intent mean, how to bump up to those felony offenses within the statute. So we made what can be a confusing statute into an easily digestible format through this cheat sheet and distributed it to our partners in the program. And this was really helpful, for example, thinking about a police officer who might not arrest for stalking because they're only hearing about a current incident that's being reported, and stalking requires a course of conduct. So if the victim was asked to identify other incidents during a police interview, it might become apparent to that officer then that the current criminal offense being reported was not the first incident experienced, and they would understand how to make out that course of conduct that was required to charge stalking. So officers were developing a new understanding of cases that were previously on their radar, and were gaining more tools to help them hold offenders accountable and arrest for stalking. One of the other big pieces around enhancing stalking arrest was looking at the investigations, and Sergeant Massey is going to talk more about this during his presentation, but we really focused too on how technology plays a role in stalking, both for victim safety and for evidence collection. And then the third goal of the program, of course, is to, once stalking victims are identified, to be able to quickly link them to comprehensive services. So we wanted to make sure that people who were interfacing with stalking victims understood the importance of tailoring safety planning for stalking victims, which might include keeping stalking journals, specific ways to enhance evidence collection or preserve evidence, and then, of course, around technology and what kind of advocacy can be done for stalking victims. We wanted to make sure that anyone who was going to come into contact with a stalking victim had the appropriate tools and resources available to them to be able to work comprehensively with those clients. So just to recap all of that, our main goals were really the early identification of the intimate partner stalking cases so that we could prevent escalation and injury and fatality, while at the same time holding offenders accountable and connecting victims to services. So what is CAPS? CAPS is essentially a training program. The first part of the training is conducted by a community partner. It's essentially a stalking 101. And we do this to set a foundation for the participants in the program to understand what stalking behaviors look like, how stalking might impact a victim, more information about safety planning and technology. After the Stalking 101, the NYPD does an in-depth training with participants about how technology is used by stalkers and how to investigate stalking incidents to make solid cases that they can then bring to the prosecutor's office. And the final piece of the training is myself partnering with the local district attorney's office, where we review hypothetical situations and work through the cheat sheet of the stalking statute to see how to apply the law, particularly looking at actual cases where stalking was not charged but could have been, and understanding if it had been charged, how it could have been bumped up to a felony offense. In addition to training law enforcement with this model, we also trained advocates and civil attorneys and other community partners. And I think what was also important in the rollout of the program incorporating into the training was also a briefing for judges. If the program was successful, we knew that the judges would be seeing more stalking cases in their courtrooms, so we thought it was important to let them know that we were working on this program, that they would hopefully expect to see more cases that would be around stalking coming before them. So CAPS was originally launched in the borough of Staten Island in collaboration with the NYPD and the Richmond County District Attorney's Office in June of 2014. We had started it in 2 precincts there and then quickly expanded to all 4 precincts that are on Staten Island. So in the year prior to the start of the CAPS program, 3 out of 4 of those precincts on Staten Island had no stalking arrests recorded for the year. Once we launched the program, within the first year that it was in operation in all 4 precincts, there was a 233% increase in stalking arrests recorded by the NYPD in the entire borough. So we were very pleased with the immediate results that we saw, and we decided to expand to another borough. So in July of 2015, we launched the program in the borough of Queens in collaboration with the NYPD and the Queens County District Attorney's Office. We did a similar rollout in Queens as we did in Staten Island, where we launched in several precincts to begin, but we quickly expanded to all of the precincts in the borough. The Queens program was just as successful as the Staten Island one was. Within the first month of the Queens launch, 2 of the precincts recorded the city's first felony stalking arrest that year. In prior years, there were either 0 or 1 felony stalking arrests for the entire city for the year. So we were very pleased that within just a couple of weeks of the program being launched, we had 2 felony stalking arrests already. After the program was expanded to all the precincts in Queens, we saw a 177% increase in stalking arrests recorded by NYPD compared to that same time period last year. And when you're looking at the actual numbers, so from January to September of 2015, there were 18 stalking arrests in Queens, and then after the program launched, during that same time period, there were 50 stalking arrests in Queens. So again, we saw immediate results from the program after the launch. And I'm now going to turn it over to Sergeant Anthony Massia, who's going to talk more about the NYPD piece of the program and about their training.
Thank you, Liz. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your day to participate. I definitely have to thank Liz for coming up with this program and implementing it across the city. It's really helped our victims and it's helped our police officers gain knowledge of what exactly constitutes a stalking offense and how to build these cases. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is how exactly the NYPD handles domestic violence. I currently am assigned to the Office of the Chief of Department Domestic Violence Unit, and reporting to our office are both the Patrol Services Bureau and the Detective Bureau. We take a two-pronged approach to domestic violence. What that means is you'll have, if there is a complaint filed, you'll have the classic precinct detective squad, you'll have the detective investigating that criminal aspect of the case. However, what we have in the NYPD are 85 individual domestic violence units with over 400, sometimes even close to 500 domestic violence officers assigned across the city. Domestic violence officers are taking all the domestic incident reports that we generate in New York City. They're reviewing them. They're trying to figure out what's going on in the home. They're conducting risk assessments. And they're actually going out and knocking on doors in many cases to re-interview the complainants, to see what's going on, and to see if they could figure out how to combine the case or figure out if there is more criminality arise. If you'd like to hear more about what an NYPD domestic violence officer actually does, we just recently posted a video on our Twitter page, NYPD DV, which is going to outline exactly what our DVOs do on a daily basis. Moving on. The CAPS implementation, we chose the pilot boroughs with the Office to Combat Domestic Violence as it initially rolled out in Staten Island and then into Queens. The training focused on what the officers should be looking for, the legal requirements, how to build a case, how to gather evidence, and then also the victim services that are available, how to conduct a proper risk assessment, and how to make the referrals. The victim services, the risk assessment, and the referrals many times take place during the home visits that are conducted as a follow-up to the incident to the domestic incident report that was generated. Last year in New York City, we generated more than 280,000 domestic incident reports for our DVOs to handle. What they do in each one of those cases is conduct a risk assessment that includes a background check on everybody listed on the domestic incident report. What that helps us identify is prior reports in that home. So maybe the prior report is something as simple as he showed up to my house or he showed up to my work, which it's just one occurrence at that point. By having the risk assessments built into our system, we're able to see that now we're starting to establish a pattern of behavior just by having that easily searchable within our DV case management system. Another important thing we've encompassed in our domestic violence program is the collaboration between the family justice centers, the advocates in those family justice centers, our local community partners, and the district attorney's office. Without the district attorney's office on board, we wouldn't be going anywhere with these cases. Oversight is done at a level, at both the borough level and then the Patrol Services Bureau, and finally the Office of the Chief of Department Domestic Violence level. What we do in my office right now is actually, on a citywide view, take advantage to take a look at all these cases. We look at the harassment complaints that are coming in individually. We look at the grouping of the cases. We look to see how the safety planning is going, because they will document what was going on during that home visit in their cases. We look to promote that they share the information from the domestic violence officer to the detective bureau. Next slide. the challenges for law enforcement. So the biggest challenge during the trainings that I give is just letting the police officers involved know how easily it is for us to figure out where they are at any given time, to figure out their social media account information, to let them know that each one of them, when they walk into my training, is usually carrying a GPS on them in the form of their phone. So what we like to do actually is have them log in to their iPhones or their Android devices and go to show them how the location services are on, to show them how easy it is to log on to the Gmail account on the internet and figure out where that phone has checked in on the IP addresses, what location services are running. We like them to find out, we also like them to figure out that they have not changed their password in years and how frequently they're using something as common as a child's name and date of birth, or they're using a password 1234, and how important it is for themselves, but for the victims that they're interviewing, to ask the right questions based on the stalking techniques that are available, which a lot of times today is technology-based. So we train the officers to identify that pattern of behavior and document it within the case. We're also going to have them obviously gather the evidence resulting in that, and also develop a system that's going to allow the officers to easily group a case. What we have in New York State is a domestic incident report. Each domestic incident report that's generating a case for domestic violence officers is going in, depending what borough they're in a different precinct. What our case management system does is we have a quick button available that's going to search across the city and come up with all the prior reports that have taken place with that victim and that offender. The evidence collection in stalking cases. On our DIR, we're going to ensure that the victim is properly writing out everything that's going on. We want to know if he's leaving flowers. We want to know if he showed up at the place of work, even if it's outside of this precinct. If you're having problems where he's saying, I know where you are right now. Those are all important things. We want to check for video at the time of the report. If the complainant victim is stating that he just showed up at my house or my place of employment, just the same way we would do an evidence collection in a burglary case, we want that same evidence collection going on in a stalking case. We want to immediately document that evidence and preserve it. Social media requests is unbelievably important in domestic violence stalking cases. What we ask our officers to do in every domestic incident report is actually ask the victim what the social media information is for the other party. We would like to know their email address, their Twitter account handle, their Instagram name, and we want to be able to track that now and in future occasions so that we could see what's being posted. We could see who's logging onto their accounts. We want the victim and also my patrol officers to take photos and screenshots of these text messages and missed calls. We really need to document each individual incident to build the entire case. Once we do have an offender arrested, what we're looking to do is also get their phone, because the same way the offender could use the phone to stalk the victim, we could use the phone to eventually, if with a warrant, get the information out of that phone to figure out where that offender was too. So the importance of a coordinated community response is that there's a lack of reporting. Many people, many of our victims will finally, when it's become violent, start mentioning everything that's happened in the past. That's when we'll hear the stories of how often the offenders have been showing up at work, about the flowers on the cars, about messaging their mother, their grandmother, their aunts, their uncles, and other family members. We won't hear about it until after it's already become violent. So what we need to do is increase the awareness, both internally and externally. Many of the individual incidents that they would have reported in the past, they're not going to rise to a level of a crime. But that's why we have our systems in place to help build that course of conduct. Because with our individual DIRs and our complaints and our case management system, then we could bring a strong case to the DA. The focus of the program was to raise the awareness internally, externally, to the victim services providers also, who are a lot of times initially interviewing complainants too, that did not go to the police first. The prosecutors, like I said many times before, are incredibly important in these case building situations. Finally, I'd like to hand it back over to Liz real quick for a summary of the entire program.
Great, thank you. So I just wanted to recap a little bit about what it would take to replicate the CAPS model in other jurisdictions. But before I did that, I just wanted to highlight what Sergeant Mathia was just talking about the intensive training that NYPD goes through. It really is so essential to this program model, the training efforts. We saw that in 2015, after we had launched the program in Staten Island, in the year of 2015, we saw no increase in stalking offenses after we had that initial bump up. And so we went out and we retrained all of law enforcement throughout the entire borough. And after that training, the training happened in January of 2016. So from January 2016 through September 4th, there was a 966% increase in stalking offense arrests on Staten Island. So we saw, again, amazing results from the retraining, and we understood how important it was to make sure that these training efforts continued and how valuable they were for the participants to really understand and identify these cases. So replicating the CAPS model, I think the key takeaways are to first understand that stalking is a lethality factor, something that needs to be taken seriously by advocates, law enforcement, civil attorneys, courts, etc. That the early identification of stalking cases can truly prevent intimate partner homicides. And so it's really essential that people are reviewing these cases as early as possible to see whether there are stalking behaviors that are occurring. It's important to create or engage an already existing coordinated community response model to address this issue. We were lucky here in New York City to already have this model in place, but it really is key to make sure that all of the key stakeholders are committed to this and are ready to participate in this coordinated model in order for this type of program model to be successful. And the main key of the program, and that's why I have it circled in red there, is really about holding offenders accountable. Although mentioned earlier in the presentation that there's a high recidivism rate for stalking offenders, it's important to recognize stalking behaviors and hold offenders accountable for those behaviors through appropriate arrests and prosecutions. The accountability for offenders helps to validate the victim experience and ensure that law enforcement and courts recognize the behaviors and take appropriate actions. And of course, essential to any program is to ensure that once the victims are identified, is to connect them to services that can meet their specific needs. So I'll turn it back over to you, Alina, now.
Sure. Thank you so much, Liz and Sergeant Mathia. If I just want to reiterate a couple of things that, Sergeant, you had mentioned, just to make sure that they aren't just lost in this general webinar. And that's that, number one, you mentioned collect that evidence right away. From our perspective here at the Stalking Resource Center, this is one of the key things that we train on as well. If you're an officer and you're there, take the picture, write it down, email it to whatever you need to do to collect that evidence. Do it right then at the scene. Because if you wait until the next day or you ask that victim to come down to the precinct later, inevitably that is the phone that's going to be lost, or the information will be deleted accidentally, things like that. So collecting that evidence right away is absolutely critical. If you can, please have resources on hand to that victim, whether it's a victim advocate agency or having them start documenting the stalking behaviors. The SRC does have a stalking log on our website, and it's free. You can download it. But it's basically a piece of paper where victims can document every single thing that's happening, and that's really important not only for them, but for any officer that later responds if they decide to report some other type of criminal activity. The second thing, Sergeant Mathia, that you mentioned was that you want to ask that victim right away what other social media that the defendant or the offender could be using. And we see this so frequently, and collecting that evidence is so important, but it's very difficult. So getting that information right away and sending those preservation requests, if you can do that, is really going to be key in helping you build that case. And finally, just remember, I think from the Stalking Resource Center standpoint, is that even though stalking, just like sexual assault and domestic violence, is underreported, severely underreported, the reality is these victims are talking to other people. they usually talk to friends or family first, but you have clergy, you have doctors, nurses, you have many different facets that the victim could seek out, a civil attorney, whoever it may be. So we have to remember as witnesses as well that these people potentially hold other clues to the entire big picture that we may not be seeing. So I just wanted to reiterate some of the things Sergeant Yu had mentioned. But with that, I do want to open it up for questions. We do have, this was scheduled for 90 minutes, but we'll obviously end early, so we can get to some of your questions. Patricia, if you want to take over in that respect, that would really be great.
Hi, everyone. It doesn't look like we have any questions coming through now. However, if you do have any questions, feel free to enter it in the chat box, and we will try and get those answered for you. So it looks like we have a question from Ginger. She's asking if there is a printed outline of the CAPS program that she could look at and see if it could be replicated to some degree at their department.
Liz or Sergeant Macia, are you still on the line?
It looks like they got disconnected. I'll go ahead and try and reconnect them back on.
Okay. Ginger, you may have to wait because I don't know the answer to that here at the Stalking Resource Center. I would assume there's something they can provide to you. So let's wait and see when they get back on. I do see one question that I think I can address.
Hi, Patricia.
Oh, there you go.
Sorry, we just got disconnected. So yes, there is an overview of the CAPS program that reiterates what we had talked about in terms of what the rollout looks like and the training that's involved. So I'm not sure the best way to get that to participants, but we're happy to send that along.
Perfect, thank you. It looks like we also have another question coming in from Julie. She is asking, how has the court system dealt with the increase in arrests and charges of stalking?
Yeah, so we've, I've stayed in touch regularly with the district attorney's offices where we've implemented this program to see if there's been any pushback from the courts or any challenges that they faced, and there have been no specific challenges. In fact, we've seen some great successes with some challenging cases that they were able to get great dispositions on in the court. So I think that briefing that we did for judges to let them know about this program and this kind of increased attention to the stalking issue was possibly helpful in preparing them for seeing more stalking cases. But I think it was also the preparation that went into the investigation of those cases and how they were carefully charging on those cases that made it very helpful too. So even though stalking cases are notoriously challenging to prosecute, I think the cases that NYPD is putting together and the charging that NYPD and the District Attorney's Office are working on together have been really effective to bring solid cases to the court.
Thank you. We also have another question from Alicia Martinez, and she asks, how are the percentages of victims, males and females, figured out?
Yeah, I can answer that for you. Basically, what we do when we go to calculate the 4% and the 2%, If you just Google, it's the answer pretty much for everything. If you just Google, like the U.S. Census Bureau, you need to look at, I think it's called like quick facts for the U.S. Census Bureau, and I usually type in like North Carolina census population, and that census population quick facts website pops up. And what you're looking for is at the very top, it'll say like 2016, 2015 population. But what you want to do is go down a little bit and look for your female population. It'll be listed as a percentage. So it'll say that females in the state of North Carolina make up 51.2%. You need to convert that to an actual number. And once you have that female population number versus a percentage, then you subtract that from your general population, right, the total population. That gives you your male population number, not a percentage, but a male population number. And then again, if you just take 4%, so 0.04 times your female population and 0.02 times your male population, that will give you, again, the statistical numbers of stalking victims, both males and females, that you'll be seeing in your state, in your community, things like that.
Thank you. We have another question from Elsa. Does the NYPD provide stalker info trainings or workshops to community members?
We absolutely encourage our DVOs, our domestic violence prevention officers, to attend community meetings. We do provide them with literature on stalking, and we have provided them with the training. Also for DV Awareness Month, for the third week of this month, we chose the topic of stalking to push out information on that. And again, that was pushed out on our social media page. So it's a quick one-page informational guide on what is stalking and, you know, just to raise public awareness on stalking as part of domestic violence.
Thank you. So a question from Michelle. With the significant increase in arrests in New York, are you seeing the same increase in convictions? How long is the process there from arrest to conviction?
So this question's a little hard to answer because we aren't necessarily tracking the conviction rates of cases where stalking is charged, and the timeline from arraignment to conviction really varies by case, by court, by borough. But I will say that with encouraging that stalking is charged more often, we're also encouraging that the conviction is actually to the stalking offense. We know that stalking might be one of many offenses that's charged on a criminal complaint, and we are encouraging the district attorney's offices to try and get pleas or convictions that include the stalking offense, especially here, because with our New York State stalking statute, so much of what enables you to charge a felony offense goes back to whether the offender had been convicted of a prior stalking offense. So it does have this bump-up element within our stalking statute, where the more stalking convictions you have, the easier it is to charge those felony offenses. So that is part of the training that we include that in there.
Great, thank you. We also have another question from Officer Kaja, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name there, with the American University Police Department, and they're asking if you have a list of common websites or apps that you find stalkers tend to use to track individuals so they can warn victims about them.
Believe it or not, the most common websites and applications that are used are really just the ones you use every day. So it's Gmail, it's changing the password to your iCloud account, it's your Facebook account, and all three of those an app and two websites have privacy filters that you can look at your security settings, and that's what we encourage first my officers to do so that they understand and they can explain it to the victims, but then our victims to do too. Take a look at those privacy settings, take a look at those security settings, and then change their passwords.
Okay, we also have another question from Diane Black. Has anyone had senior citizens as victims of stalking?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, especially within the intimate partner context, we do see elder abuse and stalking occurring in those cases. So yes, it's any age.
And I want to echo that. We at the Stalking Resource Center do train on stalking in later life. It's one of our modules that we train on. There's not a ton of research on it, but I will say yes, absolutely. Again, I think it's one of those difficult things which it's being eclipsed by what we call elder abuse. So it could even be whether it's a caregiver or a family member who's coming in and they have access to the victim's bank accounts and email accounts. Maybe they're monitoring them when they leave the house, so then they go to the house. These are all stalking behaviors, but we're lumping it in and calling it elder abuse. But yeah, absolutely, there statistically are victims in later life, and the stalkers themselves are also or can be older themselves.
A question from Don Higgins related to the convictions question. What methods are being used to hold offenders accountable? As is clearly evident, stalkers are obsessive and often refuse to comply.
So for us in the NYPD, the top method of holding the stalkers accountable is keeping great records of what's going on within that home and with that victim. What we try to do is always have our order protection information online, within our cases, so that no matter where that occurs, the next offense, that we have information available that this person is a victim of stalking and they've already been issued an order of protection if it is holding the offender already accountable. Our officers all have smartphones. On those smartphones, they're able to run the victim, run the perpetrator, and see the past history of what's going on. So when they are walking into that first offense to them, they can see all the history in the home. We also do follow up with the DA's office a lot. These cases, touch the heart of a lot of our domestic violence prevention officers, so they end up calling as if it was one of their own family members, and I think that's important too to recognize.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add to that, I think it's so critical too with all of this follow-up and investigation that NYPD is doing. It's also letting the victim know that you're taking them seriously, that you believe what they're saying. We hear so often from stalking victims that what's happening to them sounds crazy, that their offender constantly knows where they are and they have no idea how that's happening, and so the account sounds unbelievable. And so the fact that the NYPD officers are putting so much focus and attention on this and really taking it seriously really validates the victim experience and helps them to know that they can come forward for help and that they can continuously come forward for help if the stalking persists.
And also from Don, do you have any buy-in from media in terms of providing public service announcements, providing coverage to Stalking Awareness Month, etc.?
Just on the Stalking Resource Center side, that is something that we're working on. Actually, we do have something in the works where we might be hopefully doing a PSA earlier this next year for NSAM. But it is really tough, and right now, as you know, like with the NFL, the bigger topics do seem to be sexual assault, domestic violence. As is the case with a lot of different agencies, stalking is the crime that oftentimes is forgotten or at least not recognized. But we are working on it, and we certainly do try to bring as much awareness to this crime as we possibly can.
Great. And I think we would just add that, particularly pertaining to the CAPS program, we did have fantastic press coverage from our local media when we did roll it out, we were really pleased to see that the press understood how important this issue was too, and it was really essential in helping to raise awareness about stalking to have that extensive media coverage during each of the rollouts of the program.
We also have a question from Michael. Do you have advice for victims in regards to using RFID technologies as a method to stalk?
There are, we haven't had many issues, to my knowledge, to me actually, come up. However, I guess in those instances, we would encourage them to use the RFID blocking wallets or devices. And again, though, change their account information regularly if the offender does have, if they believe the offender has gotten that information from whatever device they would have used to get that.
Okay, and we have another question. For those who are not U.S. citizens who are being stalked, are the same resources available for them?
Usually the general answer is yes. If they are not citizens, they can apply for a U visa, and stalking is now one of the crimes that can be listed. So it is a protection that's afforded to them, and as long as they continue to cooperate with law enforcement, there are no ramifications that come from reporting. But in terms of other resources, I'm sure there are other agencies, and Jess, if you're listening, I'm sure you can think of them. I'm trying to think of who we did that webinar with earlier this year, but there are agencies that do help immigrant populations.
From an NYPD perspective, we're never going to ask the immigration status. We're going to treat all our victims exactly the same way, with the same level of care and referrals for services, and work on their cases in the same manner.
Okay, another question from Elsa. What resources do you have for LGBTQ stalking?
Is that for the Stalking Resource Center or for New York City specific? I guess I don't know.
She did not clarify, so maybe we could touch up on both.
Okay. From the Stalking Resource Center perspective, we know that the LGBTQ community is victimized at higher rates than the general population. There still remains a dearth of research in this area. Unfortunately for the Stalking Resource Center, we don't have a specific pamphlet that would be specific for that population. I will say, though, that, again, the NISVIS, that National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, does talk about different populations, and I believe LGBTQ is one of them. So at least you could get some statistics on that. But right now, the SRC does not have a specific handout for the LGBTQ community. Obviously, it is something we should develop.
And here in New York City, the Family Justice Center's services are available to all victims of intimate partner violence, regardless of their sexual identity or gender identity or sexual orientation. And we work closely with community groups here in New York City who specifically work with that population to ensure that our services are effective and that we have comprehensive services available.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Tatum. Is there awareness of the fact that police departments need equipment that can detect hidden surveillance devices in the victim's home and car? It is very expensive for the victim to pay for this service, and victims are often financially victimized by the stalker and unable to afford the service.
In cases where we believe GPS is being used on the vehicle, we could take a look at the vehicles. We have crime prevention officers as well as domestic violence prevention officers that could work in conjunction to try and figure out what type of device is possibly being used on the vehicle.
Another question from Don, and this is for Sergeant Messia. How is the NYPD with coordinating the investigation of stalking cases if they overlap into other crimes?
So the grouping feature I mentioned before will group both DIRs and complaints. And what that's going to mean is that when we finally are able to build the stalking case, and we do have a criminal case that's concurrently going, they're actually living together in the same domestic violence case. The criminal case might be handled by two separate detectives in different boroughs, but the domestic violence case is quarterbacked by a domestic violence prevention officer. So when it does go to the DA, you do have somebody, one person from the NYPD's point of view, to speak to regarding what's going on with that victim.
Great. Great, thank you. Another question from Michael. Many victims are not aware where RFID technologies exist. Is there a website you could recommend to find or a database to know what things, items, other than that, of course, a cell phone, that would contain these devices that could be exploited?
Sir, what we're going to do is I'm going to have to look a little bit more into RFID stalking myself too. Besides grabbing the personal identification information from cell phones or credit cards, or I'd like to look into it too, and something that we definitely could look into pushing out to our police officers.
Great, thank you. It doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in. I think that was the last one. So just as a reminder, before I forget, a brief survey will appear on your screen after I end the meeting in a few moments here. And if for any reason the survey does not automatically come up for you, feel free to enter the room again using the same link, and you can retrieve the survey via the web links box. I will also input the evaluation survey in the chat box for you as well. So if you have any last minute questions, feel free to type it in the chat box. We do have a few more minutes here before the event is over. It doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in, so if the presenters are ready, I can go ahead and close the presentation.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you again to the New York City Mayor's Office. We really appreciate all that you are doing to combat the crime of stalking.
Thank you so much. We're so happy to participate today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.